When we think of big video games, we usually imagine games that sell millions of copies and become huge hits, but sometimes even highly anticipated games don't sell as well as expected. In this video, we'll talk about some amazing games that were well made but didn't sell as much as their publishers wanted. So without wasting any more time, let's dive right in. Skull and Bones is a pirate-themed action-adventure game from Ubisoft that went through over a decade of development struggles before finally releasing on February 16th, 2024. It actually started out as a multiplayer expansion for Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, but eventually became a standalone title. However, it faced a ton of delays and changes in direction along the way. Ubisoft invested a whopping $200 million into the project, with some of that money even coming from the Singapore government. That's a lot of pressure to perform well financially. But despite its potential, the game just didn't seem to click with players. It got mixed reviews from critics, with scores ranging from 57 to 64, depending on the platform. And user ratings were even lower, with some people giving it as low as 3.1 out of 5 stars. The game's $70 price tag, or $100 for the premium edition, frustrated many players who felt it only offered a $30 to $40 experience. Its launch was also underwhelming, with only 850,000 players in the first week, including those who tried the free trial. That's way lower than other big 2024 releases like Tekken 8 and Persona 3 Reload, both of which sold over 1 million copies in the same time frame. The game's release timing didn't help either, as it launched alongside other highly anticipated titles and was frequently compared to Sea of Thieves, another pirate-themed game that had already built a large player base over time. While the game didn't achieve blockbuster sales, it remains a notable attempt at innovation in the pirate genre, appealing to players who enjoy deep tactical gameplay even if it didn't capture the broader audience Ubisoft had hoped for. I picked up Kingdoms of Amalur randomly when I was a kid, and I was super surprised by how much there was to do. There were tons of quests, and most of them were actually fun. The game also got pretty tough in the later levels. I thought it'd just be a good way to kill time until a new game came out, but I ended up really liking it. It sold an impressive 330,000 copies in its first month in the US alone, and globally, it reached a whopping 569,000 copies in just its first week. By the time it reached 90 days, it had sold 1.2 million copies. But behind the scenes, things weren't looking so great for its developer 38 Studios. The company, founded by former baseball player Curt Schilling, had taken a massive $75 million loan from the state of Rhode Island. To break even, the game needed to sell over 3 million copies. Even though it sold over 1 million copies and even exceeded Electronic Arts expectations, it just wasn't enough to save the studio. 38 Studios went bankrupt, leaving employees unpaid and triggering a state investigation into its finances. Years later, in 2020, THQ Nordic picked up the rights and released Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning, a remastered version with upgraded graphics and all the DLCs. It was great to see the game get a second chance, but it's hard not to wonder what could have been if it had turned into the franchise it was meant to be. Anthem was developed by BioWare and published by Electronic Arts, and it came out on February 22, 2019 as an online multiplayer action RPG. Before it launched, EA had super high hopes for it. They were thinking it would sell around 5 to 6 million copies in just a few months. And to be fair, there was a lot of excitement around it, with people loving the demos and marketing. And at first it did really well. In fact, it had the second best launch month in BioWare's history, just behind Mass Effect 3. But then things started to slow down. By the end of it all, Anthem sold around 5 million copies, which wasn't quite what EA was hoping for. Now, 5 million copies might sound like a lot for some games, but for a big budget game like Anthem, with huge development and marketing costs, it just wasn't enough. I mean, when you compare it to other EA games like Battlefield or Star Wars Battlefront, which sold tens of millions of copies, you can see that Anthem just didn't quite hit the mark. One of the main reasons for this was that the game had a really tough development process. BioWare only had 15 months to finish the game, which is a really tight deadline. This rush led to some technical problems and design issues that really hurt the final product. So to try and fix things, BioWare announced plans for a big overhaul called Anthem Next in February 2020. But then, in February 2021, EA decided to stop working on it as the game's popularity just kept dropping. Today, Anthem is remembered as an ambitious project that just didn't quite live up to its potential. It's a good example of a game that had a lot of promise but just couldn't meet the high expectations that were set for it. Alpha Protocol development started back in 2006 when Sega approached Obsidian Entertainment with an idea for an espionage-themed RPG. The team drew inspiration from iconic spies like Jason Bourne and James Bond, as well as movies like Syriana and Ronin. They wanted to combine the best of RPG storytelling with espionage action. When the game finally launched in 2010, it actually sold a decent 700,000 copies in the US and Europe within the first month. But despite this, Sega considered it a commercial failure. They had really high hopes for the game, partly because they'd invested a lot in marketing, but it just didn't perform as well as other big titles like Modern Warfare 2. Unfortunately, this led to Sega canceling any plans for a sequel. The game's development wasn't without its challenges either. It was originally supposed to come out in 2009, but it got pushed back to 2010 to give the team more time to polish it and get it just right. Sadly, even with the extra time, the game still didn't quite live up to Sega's expectations. In June 2019, sales of Alpha Protocol were actually halted for a while due to some expired music licenses. Luckily, those issues were resolved and the game is now available again on platforms like GOG and Steam. So, you might remember that back in 2022, Deep Silver and Volition decided to reboot the Saints Row franchise. They poured a whopping $100 million into the game, hoping to bring it to a whole new generation of players. But unfortunately, it just didn't quite live up to expectations. Despite its high production value, the game only managed to sell around 1.7 million copies worldwide, which is actually the lowest number in the entire series. That's a big drop compared to Saints Row the Third, which sold 5.5 million copies, and Saints Row 2, which hit 3.4 million. Launched in August 2022 for PlayStation, Xbox, and PC, the reboot initially attracted over 1 million players, but it struggled to reach the 2 million sales needed just to break even. Things didn't get much better from there, with the game's price dropping pretty quickly after launch, likely due to some mixed reviews from critics and players. The publisher Embracer Group later confirmed that the game just didn't give them the return on investment they were hoping for. One of the main issues with the reboot was that it just didn't feel like Saints Row to a lot of fans. The tone and gameplay design got a lot of backlash, with many longtime players feeling like it lacked the charm and identity of the older games. Although the developers did release some post-launch updates to try and improve things, they just couldn't seem to generate enough interest to turn the game's reputation around. Have you heard about the game Concord? It was supposed to be this huge, ambitious, multiplayer first-person shooter from Firewalk Studios and published by Sony. It launched on August 23, 2024 for PlayStation 5 and PC with the goal of standing out in the crowded world of hero shooters. Unfortunately, it ended up being one of the biggest gaming flops in recent memory. After an impressive 8 years in development and a massive $400 million budget, the game received mixed reviews from critics and players alike. Many felt that Concord didn't bring anything new to the table and that it was already feeling outdated compared to popular games like Overwatch and Apex Legends. To make matters worse, it was a full-priced game in a genre where most of its competitors were free to play, which was a major turnoff for a lot of players. But the final nail in the coffin came just 2 weeks after launch when Sony announced that they were shutting down Concord for good. By September 6, 2024, the servers were offline and every copy of the game was refunded. In October 2024, Sony shut down Firewalk Studios, the developer behind the game. It's crazy to think that Concord is now one of the shortest-lived online games ever with a lifespan of just a few weeks. I mean, it's not even close to the shortest title, which still belongs to the Culling 2, which lasted a mere 8 days. But still, it's pretty wild to think about how quickly Concord went from being this highly anticipated game to being completely shut down. Vanquish is a high-octane third-person shooter developed by Platinum Games and directed by Shinji Mikami, known for his work on Resident Evil. It's widely considered one of the most innovative games of its kind. Critics just loved it, with IGN even naming it the best sci-fi game for PlayStation 3. But despite all the critical acclaim, Vanquish didn't exactly fly off the shelves. It sold around 1 million copies across all platforms, which is pretty low for a AAA title, especially considering how well it was received by critics. However, over time, Vanquish has developed a really dedicated cult following. Even though it didn't do great at first, new players have discovered it and fallen in love with it. The 2020 remaster, which was included in the Bayonetta and Vanquish 10th anniversary bundle, really helped introduce the game to a new audience. And even though it's been a while since its release, fans are still holding out hope for a sequel. Despite its initial commercial struggles, Vanquish remains a beloved game and its loyal fan base is still going strong. Suicide Squad. Kill the Justice League was one of the most hyped games of 2024. I mean, who wouldn't be excited about a game developed by Rocksteady Studios, the same team that brought us the amazing Batman Arkham series? Fans were super hyped to see what they could do with DC's anti-heroes, but unfortunately, things didn't quite go as planned. Even though it's connected to the Arkham franchise, the game just couldn't seem to find its footing with players. The physical sales were really disappointing, and it actually sold worse than another comic book game, Guardians of the Galaxy, which also didn't do great. And if you look at the numbers on Steam, it's pretty shocking. The player count dropped from 13,500 at launch to less than 900 in just a few weeks. That's a huge decline. Warner Bros. Discovery even confirmed that the game's poor sales contributed to a massive $200 million loss for the company. Rocksteady had some big plans for the game, with 4 seasons of post-launch content set for 2024. But with such a rough launch, it's hard to say if the game will be able to bounce back in the long run. Warner Bros. Has already announced that they're going to focus more on live service games with strong player engagement rather than standalone titles. So it's a tough spot for Suicide Squad: Kill the Justice League, and only time will tell if it can turn things around. Senua's Saga Hellblade 2 is seriously stunning, with visuals and performances that are top-notch. But despite all the hype, it didn't quite blow up the sales charts like we thought it would. I think one reason for that might be that it was available on Xbox Game Pass from the get-go, which meant some folks might not have felt the need to buy it outright. And let's be real, the game's relatively short length of 7 to 8 hours, paired with its $50 price tag, might have given some potential buyers pause, especially when compared to those bigger, more sprawling AAA titles out there. So, how did it actually do in terms of sales? Well, in May 2024, it ranked 37th in the US for full game sales, which isn't terrible, but it didn't even crack the top 100 in Europe. On the other hand, when it came to Game Pass engagement, it did pretty well, ranking 12th. That tells us that people were interested, but maybe not interested enough to keep playing for the long haul. When you compare Hellblade 2 to the original, which sold over 1 million copies by 2018, it's clear that the sequel didn't quite perform as well. And I think that's because the gaming market is changing, and subscription services like Game Pass are becoming more and more popular. The game's emotional themes and niche subject matter might have also made it less appealing to a wider audience. But even though the sales numbers might not have been what everyone hoped for, the game is still an amazing experience that's definitely worth checking out. So you know Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy game? It's actually a really great game that critics and players loved. It got an 80 out of 100 on Metacritic, with people raving about its story, characters, and awesome 80s soundtrack. The writing was top-notch, making you really care about the team's banter and struggles, and the combat was a blast, letting you mix Star-Lord's shooting with the Guardians' special moves. It even won some awards like Best Narrative at the Game Awards 2021. But commercially, it didn't quite live up to Square Enix's expectations. They admitted that sales were a bit of a letdown. down, although they didn't share exact numbers. Estimates suggest it will sell around 1 to 2 million copies by mid-2022, which isn't bad, but not exactly what they were hoping for with a big Marvel name like that. By late 2022, Square Enix said sales were picking up, especially after they started offering discounts and adding them to services like Game Pass, but it still didn't meet their initial targets. Now, Square Enix tried to give the game a boost by offering sales and discounts starting in November 2021, which helped improve its performance over time. By November 2022, the game had actually reached over 8 million players, thanks in part to being included on subscription services like Xbox Game Pass and PlayStation Plus Extra. But even with that growth, it still didn't quite meet Square Enix's original expectations. So Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy isn't really a flop in the classical sense. It's not a bad game that totally bombed. It's more like a sleeper hit that just took a little longer to find its footing. Over time, with sales and word of mouth, it's gained more love. But back in 2021, it just didn't take off the way its makers had hoped. That's it for today's list of huge games that just didn't sell as well as we thought they would. It's crazy to think how some of these amazing titles didn't get the attention they deserved, right? Even though they didn't hit the big sales numbers, many of them still have strong fan bases and are remembered as great games. If you've played any of these games, or if there are others you think should have made the list, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it, and be sure to subscribe for more awesome content on underrated games. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.